user. It says that Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré increases salaries of civil servants by 50% and reduces salaries for MPs, ministers, and other politicians by 30%.
Africa's problem was never the lack of ideas. It was the abundance of people paid to prevent them from working. For decades, the continent was told that progress meant waiting for permission, for loans, for approvals, for investors who never arrived. But now, one small nation has stopped waiting. Burkina Faso, a country that the world once mocked for being poor, is now forcing the world to explain why it's suddenly working without them. Because Captain Ibrahim Traoré hasn't just changed policies, he's changed priorities. He cut the salaries of his own officials, not for headlines, but to make a point. Leadership starts with loss. The question now is simple and terrifying to those who built their power on African weakness. What happens when one leader stops asking how to fix the system and starts asking who broke it? Let's find out. It began without warning. No parade, no press conference. Just a government bulletin, dry and factual. The kind you'd almost scroll past, announcing salary cuts across every level of Burkina Faso's administration. It was small on paper, but seismic in consequence. Because that single decision exposed something Africa had quietly accepted for too long. That government service had become an escape from the struggles of ordinary life, not a commitment to it. In most nations, cutting salaries is political suicide. It threatens comfort, provokes resentment, and shakes the inner circle. Yet Traoré did it without hesitation, and crucially, without exception. Ministers, generals, bureaucrats, even presidential aides. Everyone. He didn't sell it as a sacrifice. He sold it as a correction. "We work for the people," he reportedly said, "so we must first live as they live." That line, simple as it sounds, carried the weight of a revolution. Because beneath it was a direct indictment of the entire African political elite, the air-conditioned class that claims to serve the continent while living lives entirely detached from it. In one move, Traoré cut not just salaries, but also the psychological distance between the government and the governed. He dismantled privilege as an institution. The West called it populism. But in truth, it was pure governance logic. For decades, external economists have told African leaders to cut public spending. They meant hospitals, schools, food programs, never their own consultancies. Traoré's version flipped that script. He began his cost-cutting at the top where excess actually lives. And that's what made this move dangerous. Not because it threatened the economy, but because it threatened an entire mindset that depended on inequality to function. Then came the silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of calculation. Everyone, from diplomats to local businessmen, started watching what would follow. Was this a one-time gesture or the opening shot of a larger transformation? Traoré answered without speaking. One decree after another followed. Education, agriculture, industry, welfare, a rapid cascade that revealed there was no improvisation here. There was a plan. To understand that plan, you have to understand how Traoré thinks. He operates like an engineer, not a politician. Every reform builds on the last, each one repairing the next weak link in the national chain. Cutting salaries wasn't about saving money, it was about establishing credibility. You can't demand sacrifice from the public when the state looks bloated. So he began where it hurts the most at the top to earn the moral right to demand change from everyone else. And it worked. Civil servants who had long dismissed reform as empty rhetoric suddenly realized this was not a government running on talk. It was running on principle. The pay cuts were more than fiscal policy. They were an act of cultural surgery. They stripped away entitlement and forced officials to face the same inflation, the same food shortages, the same reality they had governed from a distance. But it also did something deeper, something rarely discussed in economics. It created moral currency. When leaders live modestly, citizens give more willingly. When the government shows restraint, the public shows faith. That trust, once lost, is the hardest capital to rebuild and the easiest to underestimate. And this is where the turning point begins. Because once Traoré had earned the moral currency, he started spending it, not on luxury, but on transformation. He began pouring it into the nation's youth, reshaping education, and redefining the meaning of public service itself. Which raises the next question, one that defines the future of every African nation watching him now. If the elite can finally sacrifice, can the young finally rise? When Captain Traoré turned his gaze from the cabinet table to the classroom, it wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. He knew every reform collapses unless the next generation can defend it. Bricks can build a state, but only minds can sustain it. So when he announced that university education in Burkina Faso would be free and that students would receive monthly stipends, it wasn't an act of generosity. It was an investment in continuity. In most countries, education is treated as an expenditure, something to trim during crises. In Traoré's model, it became the central tool of statecraft, because once you remove financial barriers, you don't just open schools, you open social mobility. You tell a farmer's son that intelligence matters more than inheritance. You tell a market seller's daughter that the nation needs her mind as much as her labor. That shift in psychology is far more valuable than any economic aid package. The old Burkina Faso produced graduates who dreamed of escaping. The new one, if Traoré succeeds, will produce graduates who dream of building. That's the difference between schooling and education. Schooling fills notebooks, education fills purpose. And Traoré is chasing the latter. He wants a generation that no longer memorizes answers, but questions the systems that produce the wrong ones. Every stipend he pays is a message disguised as money. Stay here, think here, build here. Because the most expensive export Africa has ever given the world isn't gold, it's talent. Every time a trained engineer leaves for France, every time a medical student stays abroad after graduation, Africa loses not only skills, but sovereignty. Traoré plans to stop that leak at the source. He's paying his youth not to run away. This is also why the decision startled the financial establishment. The IMF calls it fiscally reckless. Western observers call it unsustainable. But the real question is never, can Burkina Faso afford free education? It's, can it afford another generation of dependence? The answer writes itself. Education isn't a cost when it multiplies national capacity, it's a catalyst. What makes this policy radical isn't its generosity, but its direction. Most reforms trickle down. This one grows upward. It begins at the base with the students and builds the new administrative class from below. A state that educates its poorest citizens properly eventually makes its own elite obsolete. And that, perhaps, is the quiet revolution inside Traoré's vision. He's creating a system that may not need men like him later. But there's another layer, more subtle and more dangerous for those who built careers on Africa's dependency. Knowledge changes negotiations. Once you teach your youth how to read a contract, they stop signing bad ones. Once you teach them the chemistry behind your minerals, they stop accepting low export prices. And once they understand governance, they stop tolerating governments that treat them as spectators. Education doesn't just create jobs, it creates accountability. Still, Traoré knows ideas alone can't feed people. Enlightenment without bread is a candle in the wind. And that's where his sequencing becomes visible again, each reform leading into the next. Because after empowering the mind, he turned to the stomach. After freeing thought, he had to free production. The question wasn't merely how to learn, but how to live. So he moved from classrooms to farmlands, from theories to tractors. The next phase of his strategy wasn't about syllabi or speeches, it was about soil, sweat, and sovereignty. If knowledge can make a nation think, can food make it stand? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The real test of any revolution isn't in what it promises, it's in what it grows. And after reshaping the nation's classrooms, Captain Traoré turned his eyes to the land itself. Because no matter how educated a person becomes, if they rely on imports to eat, their freedom is rented. When over 5,000 agricultural machines, tractors, seeders, harvesters, and irrigation units rolled out across Burkina Faso, they weren't just pieces of metal. They were declarations. Declarations that Burkina Faso would no longer depend on the same global food system that has kept Africa perpetually underfed and overcharged. For decades, Western experts designed Africa's agricultural model around export dependency. Cocoa for Europe, cotton for France, coffee for the West. Africa fed global markets, but never fed itself. Traoré's policy attacked that imbalance head-on. He made it clear, Burkina Faso would now produce for itself first. The state would supply the machines, the youth would supply the labor, and together they'd reclaim something the IMF could never measure: control. This is the quiet genius of his method. He doesn't announce independence, he builds it. Every machine is an act of resistance. Every seed sown is a rejection of the myth that Africa must wait for development to be imported. Traoré's philosophy is brutally pragmatic. Sovereignty begins when a nation can fill its own plate without asking permission. it's also deeply economic. By mechanizing farming, he's targeting the single most expensive part of Burkina Faso's economy: imports. The more food produced locally, the less currency bleeds abroad. The more jobs created in rural areas, the less youth migration to cities or foreign borders. This isn't charity, it's containment. It keeps the nation's energy, human and financial, within its borders. But there's also something symbolic buried beneath the statistics. In a world where African leaders spend fortunes importing luxury foods while their citizens starve, Traoré's approach reverses the moral order. He's saying the farmer, not the financier, feeds the nation. And by arming farmers with machines instead of speeches, he's restoring dignity to the most ignored class of people, the ones who sustain everyone else but benefit the least. And here lies another unspoken truth. Agriculture in Africa was never just about hunger, it was about leverage. The one who controls food controls negotiation. That's why every Western donor program begins with grain aid. It's not generosity, it's leverage dressed as kindness. Burkina Faso, by building its own production base, is quietly dismantling that control. When you grow your own food, you no longer have to rely on others for survival. The strategy goes even deeper than farming. Mechanization means technology, and technology means innovation. Traoré's plan creates a bridge between educated youth and rural farmers. One brings technical know-how, the other brings experience. That collaboration builds an ecosystem, a national economy powered by internal synergy, not external dependency. The ripple effect is already visible. As machines reach more provinces, the demand for parts, repair services, and fuel distribution rises, creating new industries around the old soil. Rural towns once dismissed as undeveloped are suddenly buzzing with opportunity. You can almost sense it, a quiet optimism spreading across the Sahel, not because of aid money, but because of the hum of new engines. But Traoré's logic didn't stop at food, because if a country can feed itself, it must also be able to build for itself. Independence doesn't just grow in the soil, it also rises from the ground, brick by brick. So the next question naturally follows. If a nation can harvest its own food, can it also construct its own future? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. After conquering the soil, Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned to what comes next: construction. Because a country that grows its food but imports its buildings is only half free. Sovereignty can't end in the fields, it must rise from the ground in cement, steel, and infrastructure. That's why the announcement of Burkina Faso's new cement factory didn't sound like just another industrial project. It sounded like the nation's declaration of adulthood. Within weeks of its launch, the government halved cement prices, from a cost that crushed builders to one that liberated them. In one stroke, housing became affordable, roads became possible, and small contractors who once watched foreign firms dominate local projects could finally compete. And here lies the brilliance of Traoré's sequencing. Every decision feeds the next. Education created thinkers. Agriculture gave them stability. Industry now gives them tools to build. This is not random progress, it's structural logic. Each policy prepares the conditions for the next one to work. But let's be clear, this factory isn't just about cement. It's about ownership, psychological, not just economic. For decades, industrialization in Africa has meant foreign control under local banners. A plant is built, a ribbon is cut, but the profits fly back to Paris or Toronto before the ink dries. Traoré wanted to end that cycle. He made sure this factory wasn't just built in Burkina Faso, it was built for Burkina Faso. When he ordered the price slash, it wasn't generosity, it was economic strategy. Lowering cement costs sparks a chain reaction that Western textbooks never teach. Cheap cement means cheap housing. Cheap housing means urban expansion. Expansion means jobs. Jobs mean circulation of local money, not foreign loans. Within that loop lies the foundation of genuine independence, a self-sustaining domestic economy. But perhaps the most revolutionary part of it all isn't financial, it's psychological. In a continent where dependence has been normalized, Traoré is forcing Burkinabe citizens to rethink what is possible. He's telling them, you don't need to import everything you use. You can make it. That's how identity is built, not through speeches about nationalism, but through the rediscovery of capability. Still, the industry has another layer: politics. Because every ton of cement produced locally is one less ton imported from a foreign supplier. And that shift, while invisible to the average citizen, terrifies those who once profited from dependency. Every truck that leaves the factory with local cement is a small act of defiance against the economic hierarchy Africa has lived under for half a century. But Traoré's industrial revolution doesn't stop at cement. The vision is bigger: local processing of minerals, construction of value chains, and manufacturing that keeps wealth within borders. He's laying the groundwork for a new kind of African economy, one not designed for export, but for existence. What makes this moment historic is not the factory itself, but the political statement it represents. For the first time, a leader is using economics as a form of language, a language that says, "We're done asking for help to build our own homes." And yet, even in this wave of progress, Traoré hasn't forgotten the most human element of nationhood: the people themselves. Because no matter how many factories rise, no nation stands strong if its citizens suffer quietly. That's why, right after fortifying the economy, he turned to the most personal frontier of all: life itself. Because building independence isn't just about feeding the body or housing the people, it's about protecting the next generation before it's even born. So the next question emerged naturally, one that touches both policy and humanity. If a nation can build its own future, shouldn't it also protect the lives that will inherit it? After rebuilding the nation's economy from the ground up, Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned towards something more sacred than GDP or infrastructure: life itself. Because every revolution that ignores the human cost eventually eats its own ideals. And every government that claims to serve the people but cannot protect their birthright is already bankrupt. When Traoré declared childbirth free for every citizen, it didn't sound like economic policy. It sounded like moral restoration. In that single decision, he reminded the world that governance at its core is about protecting existence before it becomes memory. For decades, across much of Africa, childbirth has been a paradox, a moment of hope wrapped in anxiety. Hospital fees, delivery costs, and hidden expenses often forced mothers to choose between debt and dignity. Many gave birth at home, unassisted, because the state had no place for their pain. Traoré's reform dismantled that cruelty. He removed the price tag from life itself. And that's where his philosophy stands apart from the sterile logic of Western economics. He doesn't view citizens as data points. He views them as investments, not in numbers, but in nationhood. Because every child born safely is a potential farmer, engineer, teacher, or soldier, a living dividend of national care. In Traoré's model, protecting birth isn't welfare. It's a state strategy. This move also redefines African masculinity and power, a form of strength rooted not in dominance, but in protection. The image of a young military leader announcing free childbirth is jarring to Western analysts because it blends two worlds they never imagined compatible: uniform and compassionate. Yet that's exactly why it works. It tells Burkinabe citizens that leadership can be tough on systems while tender to its people. And this was not an isolated reform. It fit perfectly into the rhythm he'd been composing since day one. One reform building the moral authority for the next. Salary cuts earned credibility. Education builds intelligence. Agriculture built sustenance. Industry built stability. And now, free childbirth builds continuity. It closed the loop. Because what good is independence if the next generation can't survive to inherit it? But Traoré didn't stop at birth. He followed up with a 30% increase in the national budget for the less privileged. To outsiders, it sounded like populism. To insiders, it was arithmetic. Because if you've already freed the supply chains of greed, lowered costs of production, and localized industry, you can finally afford compassion without debt. The West borrows to pretend it cares. Traoré saves to prove that he does. That distinction is the essence of his model. The idea that sovereignty isn't just the absence of foreign control. It's the presence of internal balance. You cannot call yourself independent if your citizens still depend on charity to live. By redistributing wealth downward, he's correcting the gravitational imbalance that's crippled most African economies for decades, where wealth rises like smoke while the poor suffocate in the ashes. And yet, beyond the economics and applause, there's something more profound unfolding in Burkina Faso: a cultural recalibration. For the first time in living memory, Burkinabe citizens are seeing a leader who doesn't place himself above the people, but among them. Every decision, from cutting salaries to freeing childbirth, moves along one moral axis, returning power to where it was stolen. That's why this experiment is more than politics. It's philosophy. Traoré is redefining what it means to lead in Africa, not by borrowing the West's language of development, but by speaking the older, truer one of duty. The world can call it risky, idealistic, or unsustainable. But history will call it something else: necessary. Because at the heart of every great transformation lies one unspoken truth. Nations don't rise when they get richer. They rise when they get fairer. And that's what Ibrahim Traoré has just reminded Africa, that the most revolutionary act in a corrupt system isn't defiance, it's decency. If one small nation can rewrite its destiny without permission, what excuse do the others have for still waiting? Let us know in the comment section. Is Africa's freedom really about breaking chains, or about finally refusing to wear them? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.